Welcome to this third session in this program, and this is a collaboration between HealthTech Nordic and Lean Entries. And here you see the partners that I think most of you are familiar by now. We're trying to keep this small and informative at the beginning of each session. Many of you have been attending the two first sessions already, and we have one last session on Friday for you can call it basic training, but it's also something that Heikki will perhaps explain a little bit more how we will continue this program in the next year. We see it as exactly as a program because we have now the entries tool that is provided by Lean Entries and are free for most of you. And if you have any questions around that, there is a link to see from which you can actually use it for free inside HealthTech Nordic, or you can reach out to Heikki to get a price or to get an arrangement going on. And we have these sessions to complement that. And of course, we have also in HealthTech Nordic, you have the opportunity to reach out to your business advisor and try to get a more, let's say, specific support for your company. And that is also available, but we haven't really had that opportunity so much during this year because this is quite new. We had it throughout the last HealthTech Nordic, so some of you are familiar with that concept already. But now this is the first time that we have everything, all three components that have also been driving Heikki's business forward a little bit, and this collaboration has been going on for quite some while now. So I'm just going to be in the background and waiting for the chat later on and checking a little bit, and reach out to me or go through the link if you have any questions, or to Heikki, of course.
Very good.
I wish you a great morning here together.
Thank you, Markus. And in Finland, we are slowly covering the entire sector. So we are providing this same training series for the Helsinki area, Helsingfors and Oulu as well, and to Oulu region and to Tampere, where we also locate ourselves, Tammerfors. So it would be Kuopio left out of the big university cities here in Finland. And our intention is really to provide the bolts and nuts sort of basics on regulations to put you on a steep learning curve to understand what they are about. And this is what we've offered to HealthTech Nordic as well is a 10 webinar series of the regulatory essentials. So this would be number 3, and we will dive into what we call the core of regulatory requirements and talk about clinical evaluation and risk management. But we also have specific within this 10 webinar training series, we have a specific sessions also for both, for clinical evaluation and for risk management. And at the end, the post-market surveillance. In the middle, we would talk about medical device software and usability, labeling, and a few more topics. So if you are interested of this latter part, on Friday, I will launch a poll where we can ask you which of these parts would be the most meaningful for you who are online today and in the past sessions. But we are still in those first 4 sessions that we consider the very basics to give you the underlying understanding on how the regulations revolve. We have quite a European perspective on these topics, but when you tackle Europe and the MDR or the IVDR, you will come quite well prepared for any other sector also globally. Then the mechanisms of market entry are different. Let me see if there was a question already. Hans is asking about the Slack channel. Maybe Markus, you can address this question. But today we will talking about the core of the regulatory requirements. We must begin from Annex 1 of the MDR and the IVDR, the general safety and performance requirements for any medical devices. That would be the heart of the regulation. Then we move on to clinical evaluation. Afterwards, we will have a break, and the risk management after the break. And we will stay to the very basics on these topics, and you have the opportunity to follow sessions later regarding more specific clinical evaluation and risk management. From session 1, I would like to remind you, this is what we consider the first 4 early principles for any health tech company or startup on their way to market. First of all, they would need to understand that these regulations and standards are like business books full of wisdom that should be utilized, and not to do the same mistakes as many companies before you, but to use that wisdom that is condensed in these books to make your products as safe as possible. Then the first 4 principles would be to focus on your intended purpose, and that has a lot to do with clinical evaluation and risk management. Then to define the device classification, to know how much work you have ahead of you, and whether a notified body will need to be involved in your assessment. Then a list of standards to tackle what is considered the state of the art in safety at the current date. And in future, you would need to look on the new updated standards. And then a sort of a regulatory strategy that is also a requirement nowadays in the MDR and the IVDR that will provide you with a roadmap for market entry. But this is more what we are talking about today, the next 4 principles and the first 2 of them. Coming through the Annex 1 of the General Safety and Performance Requirements, which would be the heart of the MDR and the IVDR, we land on the clinical evaluation, and we land on risk management. And this is what we call the core of the regulatory requirements. And bundled together, considered, mirrored to one another, it would be the benefit risk analysis that is a very meaningful part of the Annex 1 as well to consider. Clinical evaluation versus risk management conclusions. And if you think of them on the timeline and you realize that we have just started, we are at day 1, if we didn't set up the startup yet. In the last session, in session 2, we got a little bit ahead in the feasibility phase, but we didn't move into the design control phase yet. And these concepts, the clinical evaluation and the risk management concept, they cover the entire life cycle of a medical device. So it would be essential for anyone to understand this concept at the very early stage before they move ahead. Reminder, this is the old or former medical device directive, and it's in its table of contents. And here in blue are the parts of the regulation or the directive that consider the product. They talk about the essential requirements. That would be the same as now in the MDR and IVDR are called the general safety and performance requirements. And that's first described in one of the articles, and later the essential requirements here in Annex 1 would be the heart. Then there is a reference to standards also in those articles, and clinical evaluation mentioned in Annex 10, and the risk management resides within the Annex 1. And if you look at let me take you to the table of contents of the MDR. And this would be now the Annex 1 from that table of contents. And as you can see, it builds up from several chapters, and you can find several topics that may or may not relate to your products. So you might not need to tackle all of them, but you need to consider each and every one and give a justification if they are not applicable. So let me go directly to the table. This is about risk management, but this would be the general safety and performance requirements table, and the typical method of going through the requirements by the manufacturer. So if the notified body comes and assesses you, or if it's the authority, then they would expect to see this kind of a table where you have broken down the requirements into rows that, and you can break them down even to smaller pieces if you like. But the point is that you will need to define whether this one requirement is applicable to your device or not. And if not, you would need to give a rationale on their non-applicability. And for example, the general requirements, they are applicable to every manufacturer. But for software, for example, there are plenty that don't apply. And then there may be several means and methods used to demonstrate conformity against one requirement. So it may be that this particular requirement calls for clinical evaluation, it calls for risk management, and it might call for several other methods. And those methods might repeat throughout your table here. So you might use clinical evaluation to tackle this requirement partly, and also the later ones as well. You must provide a reference to the methods, a standard if such is available, like the risk management standard. This is actually the old one. I could change it immediately. And I'm sorry, this is 19, the newest version. And then there would eventually need to be a reference in your documentation on where you've done the verification or the validation for that product. Where can it be located? What is the report or the reports then tackling this topic? And as you can see, there is a lot of information, but nonetheless, you would need to respect this part because this is the heart of the regulation. This is the most meaningful part there is. And as clumsy it may seem to fulfill this kind of a blanket, this might be the best practice on the field. And we haven't bumped into a better system. Everyone does this. Then it might be a case where there are several requirements under one requirement, like the A, B, and C. You might want to put them on separate rows if one applies to you and one doesn't, or you have different methods to comply to one requirement. So this is an example from that perspective. So it does go down into three sections: the general requirements that apply for everyone, then requirements regarding the design and the manufacturer, and then at the end, requirements regarding information supplied with the device, the instructions for use, the labeling, the CE marking, and all of that. They are described in the latter part. And then, like I said and showed in the example table, you must connect them to the relevant and state-of-the-art guidelines and standards. This is the method how you are going to prove your product safe and efficient. And this was the checklist that I just showed you. Just a second look on the first requirement in chapter 1 of Annex 1. So this is the very first requirement in the general safety and performance requirements. The device shall achieve the performance intended by the manufacturer. They shall be safe and effective. The risks, when weighed against the benefits, need to be compatible. And you should take into account the currently and generally acknowledged state of the art. That would mean the most recent standards, basically, most recent guidance document. As if you remember from session 1, this is where we started from. This was the core where we began our training series. And we believe if you focus on these topics, they align well with what you want to do as a business approaching the global markets. And the better you do, the better claims you have also for your clients. Now, before moving into the clinical evaluation, this is the point where I'd like to take the first poll. Let's actually take both polls. There's one for clinical evaluation and one for risk management. And I thought of this, I'm going to launch it now. I thought of this whether it would be better to ask if you know the basics or if you are a little bit more experienced or an expert. But then I wanted to define this in a little bit specific way to ask you whether you've been actually involved in this kind of activities that describe, for example, clinical evaluation. And this is a multi-choice question again, so pick your choices. If you consider clinical evaluation versus clinical investigation, the evaluation part is the entire clinical considerations. Clinical investigations fit in the clinical evaluation. They are part of it. And as you move ahead from the planning of clinical evaluation, clinical investigation is one of the tools that you can utilize to move ahead. So thanks for your answers. Maybe 5 more seconds if you like. And I'm going to end the poll. I'll let you learn of the results. So the majority of you haven't been involved with clinical evaluation. Some of you have, at least in the literature search part, and some have been also involved with clinical investigations. None of you have managed clinical investigations, me neither. So I have been in that position where I would be the one to run them. I've been involved, and I've been doing literature searches and such. And then the overall clinical evaluation was the last question. If you've been involved, well, basically, if you've been involved with literature search or clinical investigation, you would be involved also with the clinical evaluation overall in that case. But this also gives us the idea that we are providing you with some meaningful basics. So let me stop sharing and pick the second poll on risk management. This is also a multi-choice question, although I'm not sure if they can overlap. Have you been involved, and in what level? Have you been collecting the inputs for risk analysis? Have you been thinking of the mitigations and the controls that you place on those risks? Or are you the one who has actually managed the risk management activities in your company? And I will give you a few more seconds. And I will end the poll and share the results. So half of you haven't been there yet involved in risk management, and another half have been involved at least collecting the inputs, and some of you have been also defining risk mitigations for your devices. And none really who would be managing the risk management activities. Thank you very much. And now you also know a little bit more about yourselves on the channel. Easier to continue with the training, to know that you have some peers who haven't had that much experience either. So let's move forward into clinical evaluation. And we will talk about the related standards and the guidelines. We will start off from the literature review, talk a little bit about clinical investigations, a post-market clinical follow-up, and balancing between the necessary and what would be the business advantage for you in this area. Let me check the chat. Markus is talking about the HTN Slack channel. First of all, clinical evaluation is a term from the MDR, so from the medical devices part. And if you are dealing with in vitro diagnostics, the name would be performance evaluation because it's done in a lab, basically. And this would be the set of requirements. The MDR chapter 6, Annex 1 again, then annexes 14 and 15 are specific for clinical evaluation and investigation. I can show them to you from here. Just to give you a visual where it exists. So Annex 14, clinical evaluation and post-market clinical follow-up are described here. And then clinical investigations is the other annex, Annex 15. Then there is the old MedDev document 2.7/1 for clinical evaluation. And since there is no new one yet published that would be in line with the MDR, this document remains a state of the art. And there is a separate standard then for IVDs. But these principles are to some extent the same as for the IVDs. Then there is also guidance document on the global front. This is the GHTF, the old name of the IMDRF. Now there's a lot of abbreviations here. I hate them. This would be the Global Harmonization Task Force that was named the International Medical Device Regulators Forum later, and I described that in at least in the first session. But they provide a lot of guidance documents trying to harmonize legislation throughout the world, and then the regulators would take those into account or not. But these provide state-of-the-art level of references, for example, in clinical evaluation. So it might be good on top of the MedDev document to familiarize yourself with this GHTF SG5 document. And then if you need to do clinical investigations, there is an entire standard to cover that and what you need to take into account. Of course, there will be more requirements and more standards, but this is the basic setting and the very core. You start off from clinical evaluation planning. First, you determine the clinical benefits of your device. It has to do with the intended purpose quite a lot. And the data that you cover that you collect must cover the entire intended use or the intended purpose. And all claims, for example, the benefits that you use in your marketing material must be proven. You cannot claim anything extra that you didn't prove. That would be against the MDR. Then in the basic structure, in a very essence, the clinical evaluation plan contains the scope of the literature search that you need to do, then identify any existing sources of preclinical and clinical data for your own device or very similar devices. Then determining if any additional clinical data needs to be generated. That might mean that based on what you find from the literature and what you have already produced by yourself on your own device, you make a decision what level of proof you will need to conduct, whether it's a clinical investigation and on what level, or whether you will do without an investigation, and what that might be that you need to add on. So let's start from the literature review. This would be the first step into clinical evaluation. This would be something that I highlighted also in session 1, that you should begin that early. And even if you didn't have a plan, it might be wise to go into PubMed. I will show you in a bit, and do the first searches on your type of a product, on what you claim as your intended purpose. The rules say, and the MedDev and the MDR say, that you need to chart and appraise all favorable data that is relevant for your product, but also any unfavorable data. So this is scientific work, basically. You need to figure out all aspects related to your product. The places to find this information when you do the first search in databases, PubMed would be the, let's say, the #1 site. And I will quickly just show you the website. This is the National Library of Medicine in the United States, and it has expanded into a library that covers a lot of clinical information publications throughout the world. Then other places might be the clinicaltrials.gov at the USA, WHO, International Clinical Trials Registry, or the European Union Clinical Trials Register. You might want to dive into the UK registers or any other countries' registers. But this would be where you might start off from. And remember, when you do clinical evaluation, the requirement goes that you need to have sufficient clinical and statistical expertise within your team. So it's not that you could, that it might not be the wisest move to hire the student or the doctor student or anyone to do this if they don't have the experience. But the first round in the searches, just to get you aware of what type of solutions are there to tackle what you are trying to tackle. It might be that you do it yourself. Then the literature review would expand into a full-blown clinical evaluation. And it would be good to do that before you enter the more robust and strict design control phase. And what does the literature review help you with? It helps you to formulate your intended use or the intended purpose of the product from that day one. You would understand which target populations you are talking about. Are you safe to add kids, children, for example, or elderly people, or people with some other health risks? Or are you going to target just healthy adults? And this would also work for you to figure out any contraindications. So not intended for kids, for example, or those risk groups. And this will also help you focus in your product development. What can we claim at the early stages? You might plan ahead in your regulatory strategy to tackle more and wider intended purposes and target populations, for example. But as you all know, it's going to be quite heavy for you anyway. So maybe focus a little at the beginning. Then the review will help you formulate the design inputs. You will collect a lot of knowledge from the literature at best. On the other hand, it might be that you are the first to bring such a product on the market, and it's very hard to find anything. But basically, for any kind of a disease, any kind of a case, there is something, there is a state-of-the-art means to treat and diagnose such cases. So you will find something most likely. And that is also what you need to figure out. What is the state of the art in the clinical practice today? What are we up against with when we market our products? And what do we claim to substitute with our device when we put the product into use? Is it safer? What kind of risk profile do we express in relation to the state of the art that is nowadays? Even though the state of the art might be that it takes more time and you are bringing radical time savings, but if there are other risks that compared to the state of the art are not on an acceptable level, then you might not have a case. Then this also will bring you in the world of risks. You will find out different things from the negative side of this world, to understand that there are these issues to be taken into account. You will find information about your competitors, and you will have the ability then to better compare to equivalent products. And even if that door is quite shut in Europe now, regulatory-wise, in the United States, it's quite wide open. So you might have the market access through the 510(k) procedure just by comparing your device to the other device and without even doing any clinical investigations. The literature review probably gives you ideas on defining the direction of your D&D activities or design control. And also to give you an idea whether clinical investigations will be needed at some point. And it will be good to know this as early as possible, planning into your budgeting, planning into your funding rounds and such. Collecting information for marketing purposes, which is a very important thing. You might find things that you didn't just realize about by doing Google searches on what kind of solutions are there to do the same as your device. And of course, you will reveal business risks, but also opportunities. It might open up such views that you pivot to a little bit different area. You might just pivot a little bit to different target population, or you might just adjust that intended purpose a little bit to move ahead to the market. So when we are at this stage where you might not have any data on your own device, it's even more crucial to find the information regarding state of the art in clinical practice nowadays. So what would be the considerations here are what is the standard of care at this moment? And it might be different in different areas. And when you think of topics like reimbursement on top of standard of care, it might be very different in Germany than in Sweden or compared to the United States on what is the standard of care. And it might depend a lot also on how the doctors get their salaries. It might be that you have a brilliant product, but there's no way to get into the system because the doctor wants to follow up the patient in a traditional way, because that's how it's fixed in their system to get their salary. So you might have different kinds of obstacles ahead of you, and you might learn about them also through the literature review. So you search for standard of care, you search for alternative treatments. There might be something like yours or some different solutions in what you're trying to do. You try to find clinical investigations on similar devices and publications to prove clinical benefit on your case. It might actually be a good thing at some points that someone did something rather similar already. So you are not the first one to try to bring a novelty on the market, but someone else has done a lot of the job that you will need to do eventually to get on the market too. So there are publications that you can lean on from the beginning, and it has a lot to do then about what is the quality of that evidence. So when you have the best possible information that would come from systematic reviews, they would come from the critically appraised topics and individual articles. And at the bottom, there are only mere expert opinions that might never reach any publication in a paper. There might be some case studies and reports or white papers. Nonetheless, if you don't find anything from this higher level, let's say, then you might be even the bottom information might be very relevant for you. But that is also building the case where you most likely will need to run clinical investigations yourself. It might be that you are bringing in such novelty, even though a low risk class, that you will need to prove its performance, including the safety in a clinical intended purpose. There are different methods to look at, to try to do the searches, and that can be quite a science in itself, how to construct such searches that you will find the relevant bits and not the excess of publications. So this is where I would give it into the hands of an experienced clinical evaluation manager, let's say. And before actually going into these search methods, let me just quickly give you a glimpse on an example of a clinical evaluation plan, because we will see the same example when we move ahead here. So let's just do a little bit of recapping on those topics that we just discussed. So in the plan, you would have the scope, first of all. What are you going to cover? The team, and there would need to be someone knowledgeable about clinical issues. The MedDev guidance document tells you that you must have the device description here. And it might seem a little bit clumsy because you have that description in other documents as well. But you must remember who's looking into this document. When it transforms into a clinical evaluation report, it will be the notified body's clinician who will be handed with this document. And they will need to have all this information in a very condensed format to get an understanding of your device. So it is for the benefit of yourselves to have a complete package and description on your device in one covers. Then you have a plan, and you might have the availability to look from different sources. This is the part we are talking about currently, the literature search for the state-of-the-art data. And then you would have the second part that would be the device under evaluation, your own device. What kind of literature or data have you produced on the device or comparable devices earlier? Then the analysis, acceptability of the benefit risk ratio could be in this document or on the risk management side, but this must be here in some format for the clinician at the notified body to be able to read it. So let me just run quickly through these topics, the descriptions, technical characteristics. Preclinical data means that you've done some verification testing, for example, already, and you might bring the conclusions here from those parts. Biological evaluation on your device, usability engineering considerations. Remember, this is the plan still. This is a living document, and these will then eventually be complete in the report. Clinical risks, literature search plan. On top of the databases that I just showed you, there are also alert databases like the MODE, Manufacturer and User Facility Device Experience Database. I love that word. And this is a US database for recalls and such things that have gone wrong. You might utilize this also for your benefit to understand on competitors. FDA warning letters, the Australia's TGA databases, Canadian, UK, Germany, or other places that might be relevant for you. And you need to set the limit somewhere. You cannot go and do searches everywhere. But when you dive into one, you might, and you find something, you might be curious to look at the other areas as well. You need to define timelines, because the next time you do the literature search, you would want to continue from where you ended and not to repeat the same appraisal completely. And here we come to the keywords, the slide that I just touched, how to do the search. And this is the same now as I described here. And this is just one example of a tool that you can utilize to locate the correct clinical publications. P, this would be called PICO. The P would mean the patient or the population. I would be for intervention, C for comparison, and O for outcome. And I'd like to, here we talk about the abdominal surgery, and it might be due to a chewing gum in this example, and the outcome might be to do something on the post-operative side. Let me give you the other example. This relates to the one-channel ECG example from session 1. If you remember, this was the case with loads of standards, and we are measuring cardiac arrhythmia. So the population would be someone who has cardiac arrhythmia. The intervention would be the one-channel ECG or electrocardiograph monitoring in general. And as you can see, we can describe this in many different ways. So it is very hard to figure out the perfect search vocabulary. The comparable group of alternative devices or intervention might be multi-channel ECGs or Holters, and the outcome would be to detect the cardiac arrhythmia or identify it. And from this example here, we have drawn examples also for search terminology. And let's just quickly see what happens if we put this into PubMed. So you define, do I have any? Let me take off every additional. I had some previous choices here as filters, and I didn't want to have any first. So if you don't add any filters, you add a search wording like I just used here. And as you can see, these are quite generic search vocabulary. And you might end up with 3,000 results. And this is, of course, impossible then for you to filter out what would be the meaningful part. What should I look into? So you need to narrow that down. Maybe at the 5-year filter, to take that into a half, or if you just want the top notch, the systematic reviews, you might want to start from there, and you only come up with 23. So this is a good starting point now, and you might want to document that search method in your plan. And in comparison, let me reset everything here and use the different setting. If you define this in a little bit more detail, we talk about one channel. Let's see if I get it right. I have the systematic review on. We have no results found. Let me just take that off. We have 106. And we know now that there are no systematic reviews here. So not top notch, but something. And I might not want to do any more filtering, but at least to read the title from each one and maybe dive into the abstract of everyone that looks interesting. and remember to keep track on them on your first cycle. So you might not have that clinical evaluation plan even when you start, but you might have some sort of an idea what you are looking at, and you narrow that down, you filter that into your device's intended purpose, and try to find the best quality information. It might be that you want to narrow down only to English papers because it contains a lot of languages here as well, English being the dominant, of course, and work your way around to find the very core. Then it will be also easier for you to do the next round and define the wording and the vocabulary that you use in a better way. This was the first tryout, and now you know better what to look for, and you will adjust the search words. So a very simple example of where you start off with your literature. But then that was only to figure out on the state of the art on the market. And now the main point, of course, would be to have information on your own device. But what if you are a startup and you don't have any? Well, then this looks a lot different for you. You might want to dive into comparable devices, clinical information, although you cannot claim equivalence in Europe like you can do in United States. Then this might be very valuable information for you. And doing a good job in collecting that data, appraising it in a scientific manner, will also back up your claims, even though you wouldn't even claim these devices to be equivalent, but similar in some sort. But this would be the cycle, and you can apply this kind of thinking to the state-of-the-art literature. You start from zero, so you scope out and plan, and that's what the clinical evaluation plan in general is. It contains other topics as well. Then you identify any pertinent data regarding your device, that if you don't have any, then you need to generate that. But in general, you can use the same thinking again for the state-of-the-art literature. You identify it, you can appraise it on its strength, if it's from these systematic reviews, or where does it come from. Then you analyze the clinical data and you make conclusions on whether you will need to create, for example, the clinical investigation or not. So this would not be the end of your activities in clinical evaluation, but you would move on to the next stage. What did you learn on the first cycle? You go ahead and adjust your search vocabulary. You do the next round of appraisal of new data that you found. And I believe before getting your first device on the market, the people working on clinical evaluation will have gone through a few cycles at least. And on each cycle, you are building a stronger and stronger case. And imagine if you start off even without a plan, just by looking into the literature. That would be your first cycle, and reveals you a ton of things that are important. Even the fact that you don't find any information is very crucial for your success on the market. Then you are all alone to build that evidence, and that is not a very, let's say, the cheapest place to be. It will require some resources and funds. And of course, clinical evaluation, as I highlighted, is something that runs throughout the life cycle of the product. So once you get it on the market, it continues. Any incident, any topic, new risks appear, you need to redo this cycle on a, let's say, mini scale, or in a larger scale. The appraisal. This is from the GHTF. Now, sorry for the bottom. I need to keep my cursor up here. So at the bottom, there is a source, the GHTF document. It provides you with good examples of appraisal tables. And as you can see, this is scientific activity. So you would need to compare, first of all, hopefully, to the information that you can collect from the clinical publications or from your own sources is from your actual own device. Then you have the opportunity to compare to other devices, but the strength already degrades if let's say the lower you go in the grading. So you have more to prove for the notified body when they assess you. And a load of items to consider. Do you have the appropriate device? How is it applied in clinical setting? What kind of intended purpose does it have? What kind of patient groups are these products and devices covering? And the data that has been collected, does it contain sufficient information? And then the other table describes the data contribution. What type of data did you find? So are these the systematic reviews, or are they something else? Are they just white papers? So how well was the design of the study explained? Was it appropriate? What were the outcome measures, follow-up, statistical significance of that data, and the clinical significance? And the better grading you get, the better, the more you can then lean on such evidence and information in providing the proof for your own data. And I could go on to describe that part also through the clinical evaluation plan. Let me see if there are some pics that I'd like to take. This was the same picture here. This is now where we're at, the device under evaluation, the second part. You can think of this in two parts: the state-of-the-art data that is already there. How are clinicians addressing what you are trying to address with your technology? And then the second part would be your device and diving into what kind of evidence you have on your own device. And the cycle that I explained to you comes more and more relevant as you move ahead. When your device has been on the market for 5 years, you have most likely generated the kind of folder on your own device as well, maybe even publications and articles that then support your claims and support your marketing and business as well. And as you can see, the same sources can be used. Keywords can be quite the same as above. You must go through this in a scientific manner. These are the same tables explaining how you dive into it, and then it expands into Excel sheet again. What are the outputs, and what other data is there held by you as the manufacturer? Do you have complaints, vigilance activities in your own domain already? Customer complaints, your clinical investigations, well, they were covered earlier already. Any customer service, all kinds of data that might support what you claim. And then you analyze that. You do the benefit risk thinking and claims. And then you have a clinical development plan to move ahead and look into the post-market activities. And this must be, post-market is something proactive that you need to plan ahead, and they are very much married with clinical evaluation. So again, you might have same descriptions in two different documents. This, you must remember, goes to the clinician at the notified body, or if you're a class 1 device and you are not assessed by a notified body, then it might be your competent authority in your country. They as well, this might be the #1 document, the clinical evaluation report, then provided according to the plan that they look at, and they need to take these considerations into account. So a little bit more on the clinical evaluation principles. Depends on your device class, of course, and the type. The activities that you do should be flexible and appropriate to your device, its intended purpose, and the risks involved. So it's not that you need to take into account every step on the same level of seriousness as the class 3 device provider. Each device looks different. They have different risks, and despite same risk classes, there are different types. So it looks different for each type of a device. And the flexibility here and appropriateness means that that you will need to use your brain basically to do what is necessary. If you present your information to a client and you don't have all the considerations that a clinician would expect, then that is a great business risk. You might need to run a new clinical investigation. that is not what you want to end up with. So take into account all the negatives, all the positives, and draft that into a scientific level of clinical evaluation planning and reporting. Conducted throughout the life cycle of a medical device, it never ends, and you need a qualified individual or team to do this, maybe even a clinician or a clinician at least to review this and sign it off, or a team of clinicians. And then remember, when you put your medical device into a clinical investigation, they also must fulfill the general safety and performance requirements in the Annex 1 of the MDR or the IVDR. And this is a little bit, how do you say, might be complex if you are at the point where you are just now collecting that information to make sure that it is safe. But it is a good point to take to understand again that how soon you will need to do the verification part for your device. So you need to make sure that if your device is an electromedical, it fulfills at least the most parts of the 60601 standard. And the ones that it does not, you will need to provide a rationale for the hospital who you work with, for the authorities when you ask them for permission to run this investigation, for the ethics committee that takes their stance on whether it's okay to run the investigation. So maybe not all parts of the requirements are fulfilled, but you have enough understanding that it should be safe to investigate in the clinical setting. Sorry, I will just quickly have some water. And here are the general rules. I don't remember if we went them through, but clinical investigations are basically needed if there are any gaps that you need to address in the Annex 1. Any residual risks require answering. So the notified body was pleased with the level of proof that you gave them and to CE mark your product, but it was agreed that you will try to find answers for these remaining risks that may be low enough for the product to function correctly and safely, but in the long run they might cause some problems. So let's figure those out in the post-market clinical follow-up, for example. The benefit risk analysis provides an unacceptable profile. And notice if your product is a class 3, let's say active implantable device, and you have an unacceptable profile, it might be that they don't let you do the investigation at all. So it's you need to find ways to prove the safety of the product on the bench before bringing it to the clinical setting. In general, if the device is an implant or class 3 device, there's no way around it. You need to do investigations. In the past, the world was a little bit more flexible. That even for the lowest risk class devices, especially where it bears some new technology or technology with little or no experience. It might be that you are wise to do some investigation. And also, again, if this is a pure novelty and no one's done any before you, then you might need to do this purely for your marketing purposes. So always remember the marketing perspective of things. And when you plan a clinical investigation and you have all the regulatory and standard requirements tackled, remember to discuss with your marketing department and sales what would they need. Would they need this one additional piece of information on the questionnaire for the clinicians, for example, that make it a lot easier for them to sell the product. And if you extend the intended purpose of your technology, let's say a software that is updated quite frequently after it's first launched and CE-marked, you might need to consider whether the update or the new intended purpose then requires new clinical investigating. Or it is that you want to expand from only adults to adults and children in your intended purpose. Core elements in a clinical investigation according to the standard. Well, you need to have a plan. There is something called investigator's brochure that is handed to and planned with the let's say the principal clinician who runs the investigation. Site selection agreements with the hospital, informed consents with the patients, a lot of paperwork to be done. And of course, the permission from the ethics committee of the hospital, or however it is organized in your home country or in the country that you are running the investigation in, and the permission depending on how your local authority is organized to conduct the investigation. In Finland, you need a permission from the authority. Then after product launch, once you have CE-marked the product, the evaluation goes on, and the clinical evaluation report must be updated according to these requirements from the MDR. Every year for high-risk devices, you must open up the report and review it for whether if it's sufficient. Every 2 to 5 years for low or moderate risk devices. And remember, when you have a novelty, you might use this mechanism for your benefit and do the systematic review more often, even half a year. It might be that something shows up in the literature while you're at it. It might be the hottest topic on earth that you are resolving. So you might want to go into PubMed and do the searches every month and repeat it. And remember at some time points also to document them properly and do the appraisal and add on to your information. There is a risk that you end up finding something negative, but that's what you must also take into account. So it will be highly valuable for you as well. When you have any new post-market surveillance data, like incidents, feedback, complaints, that you might need to update your report. And if you do any changes on your design, then of course this cycle continues, and the changes may be triggered again by multiple things. And then when you are on the market, there are these two tools of which we have a separate session. It would be the session 10 when we get there. These cover the proactive systematic manners on collecting data. And post-market surveillance contains the post-market clinical follow-up activities, which can be expanded even into an investigation, may require further investigations. This is also a continuous process, and it updates the clinical evaluation, and it's proactive. and more about them in the later sessions. And then finally, before go for a break, clinical evaluation as compared between the old directive and the new medical device regulation. Now, there is a specific consulting requirement for notified bodies if the device is class 3 or a certain class 2B device. Mainly for implants, unless they are very specific type, simple implants. So this will also add on to your timelines. It's not just that it would be looked over by the notified body, but it goes to an expert panel under the European Commission. So you need to prepare for stretched timelines in that sense. And also for new pairs of eyes to look into your claims. The MDR brought with it the blockade of using equivalency to reach the market. This Article 61 defines that you would basically need to have the technical documentation and an agreement with your competitor for that device to be compared to yours as an equivalent. Then it might be that this is enough and no clinical investigations are needed to get on the market. So this door has quite efficiently been shut. But if you think of the larger companies, it's still quite open for them because they can easily compare to their existing products within their own product portfolios if they are equivalent. There is a lot more increased focus now on post-market surveillance and the post-market clinical follow-up in the MDR. And what this has generated since the MDR was published in 2017, many manufacturers focused on upgrading their post-market clinical follow-up activities. And they were still running under the old directives, but they were begun to build a stronger case for the MDR because this was a new requirement. And wherever their clinical claims were not backed up with sufficient information, or it was completely based on the equivalency towards competing devices, this might be a very critical activity to do to ramp up the collection of clinical data. And then again, this aligns quite well with anything you do in marketing in the health tech sector. So it's nothing excess, but again, you should go into the standards and the guidelines and understand that everything you do builds a better foundation for your product and for your company to succeed on the market. And the more efficiently you take this into account, the more efficient you will be to reach the market. So this was the first half of it, and then let's dive into an introduction of risk management. And there will be a session focusing on clinical evaluation in practice later on. That will run into more details of what the clinical evaluation is. So let's now take questions if you have any, and continue then at 10:20 your time. I will pause the recording for a while. All right, here we go. So let's move from clinical evaluation into the other core regulatory requirement that would be the risk management. And let's stay on an introductory level of what that means and take it into another session to go through what it means in more detail. ISO 14971 would be the state-of-the-art standard for risk management. We will talk about the sequence of events and risk analysis, FMEA as the model, risk mitigation, and in the end, benefit risk conclusions in a nutshell. Again, for risk management, these are the principles that you would follow. In the MDR and the IVDR, risk management is basically named and referred to in Annex 1. So that's where you will find it from the general safety and performance requirements. And now the new version of 14971, which is in many ways a lot better version also, is published in December 2019. So it might be that your notified body does not require you to work according to this new standard, but it would be again the most smart move to if you're at the stage where you are starting up. So lean on the best practice and the newest practice. The changes are not so dramatic that it would create you any harm, but the benefits from using it, because it's a bit more clever text, will help you out. And it's not just this one standard, but you will need to consider risks through many different technical standards as well, like the usability considerations, software, biological safety, or for example, the medical safety of your product. And they cross-reference the ISO 14971 standard. So this is just a core, and then risks are considered in plentiful of standards. Risk analysis would be the first step into risk management. And if you remember from session 1, we also want to highlight that do the first round even on the post-it note. It doesn't matter on what level you do it. Just like with clinical evaluation, start from the literature search and do it, make it grow little by little. So at least write them down, because you talk about them in your design meetings anyway. Risk analysis would then, in a broader concept, mean charting of the foreseeable flow of events. And that's where we already go into defining what you need to consider. It starts from thinking of hazards that may trigger a harm through the hazardous situations. And then further estimate and evaluate those risks. So no matter what the format and skills, start writing these down at least from day one. Then you will be more capable of asking for help also from any external parties or your the startup next door. How did they do risk management? And then slowly expand it into a full-blown risk management procedure. And this is not very scientific unless you have very specific quantitative data in your, let's say, for example, on the clinical evaluation part of your product. So you can lean on some statistics actually. But in most of the cases, you need to start off at least from a very qualitative perspective. You don't have much information regarding risks, so it all happens in your meeting room between the people and the team who's working on the product. The most common medical device risk management model, it owes to the failure modes and effects analysis (FMEA) model that is used for design and production in many sectors. And it looks a little bit different, so you couldn't say that this is FMEA what we're doing, but it doesn't matter. This is done based on the regulations, and you need to take the regulations into account first of all. Some tools like Polarian, Soft Comply that I talked about in session 2 might contain these models that you can then work around with. You don't need to use Excel, for example. And this would be also the model that I will just show you in a bit, that the authorities and the notified bodies are accustomed with. So let's take a look at what the risk management model might look like, just to give you a little glimpse what we're going to run through in these few tens of minutes. It begins from planning, and figuring out severities and probabilities in advance is what you need to do. So you set the levels before you start figuring out what are you set up the acceptability levels and what is considered unacceptable before you start then assessing your risks. And I will come back to this, but then the sequence of events would flow through the hazards and hazard situations and the harms, through the mitigations for the product and risk control verification, any residual risks that remain after the mitigation, and some additional considerations. Actually, for simplicity's sake, let me just take this one part off. Doesn't really help, hasn't helped. But let me go through this in, let's take it into the very basics. I will run through these items in 3 formats. One is that Excel format, one is now my slides, and one is from the actual standard. Let me pick that up very quickly. So we will look at the process flow from the ISO 14971 itself. So what you need to consider is the scope of the risk analysis, and you need to have a risk management plan again. But at the very early stages, if you didn't start up yet, just write down anything that resembles a risk or might sound like a risk on a piece of paper. Then the risk analysis is based on the foreseeable sequence of events. So the hazards would come first. They are the potential source of a harm, which might be, for example, a bleeding skin. Then there is the hazard situation. How was the patient exposed to the hazard? And it might be that there is a knife in use in places where there should be some kind of cover on it, or any safety precautions to take. And the harm is then actually the physical injury or damage to anyone's health. And it might be the patient, it might be the user of the device, or someone else. Then you estimate and evaluate those hazards and harms. What is the severity of the harm? And what is the probability of occurrence of that harm? And I will talk about the P2, P1 and P2 a little bit later. And here, if you really don't have any data to support this, it's quite easy to understand that the risk evaluation will need to be based on something qualitative, your own considerations with your team, with clinicians. And this table that I present here, criteria, it is the probability part then, if you have more data, that you can base it on quantitative data as well. So the severity might run from catastrophic to negligible, and it's up to you to name these categories, and it's up to you to define how many are relevant. Here, this example covers 5. This is a 5 times 5 matrix, but at very simplest, it might be even a 3 by 3, so only 9 boxes to fill and define. If it's enough, if it's justifiable to have such a matrix, then it might be even a better matrix to utilize than a very detailed one. But it has everything to do with your intended purpose, how it breaks down into severities, for example, in the clinical use. So maybe a 5 by 5 is a good example of a matrix. And the probabilities, then how often it might happen, or how improbable it is. And then you set the levels, and many of you have seen that there might be a yellow region in between the acceptable risk and the unacceptable risk. You can utilize that by all means, but the MDR does not recognize that. So the MDR only says that every risk must be mitigated as much as possible. It doesn't leave you any consideration whether there is a kind of an as low as reasonably possible range. From the regulatory regulations point of view, that would be just as green as the green. So if you bring it from outside of the unacceptable risks into any other region, then that would be acceptable in general, and you can bring it to the market, and it's up to you to define those regions. Then let's go back here. So we learned a little about the severity and probability, and then the next step would be to control the risks. You give these some values, for example, and in the table it might look like this. So there's a value for severity and a scale running from 1 to 5. So the severity here might be 1, probability here might be 3, and the equation is S times P, and it's 3. And it's already at the green level, but the medical device regulations say that you still need to mitigate it as much as possible. And here in this example, we've managed to bring it down by 1 notch, which is not very essential. We're not talking about the great risk here in this example at all, but it might be something that has a lot to do with the usability of the product and the experience of the patient on how it looks to them. So you need to pay attention. Also from the business perspective. Then the controls you can apply. There are 3 different types, and these are named in the MDR, in the Annex 1, and they are also named in the ISO standard. And the best bet is always to design the safety into the product, so it's inherent in the design. The second best choice would be to have protective measures in the medical device itself or in the manufacturing process. So it might be an alarm that you put on the medical device, that it gives a sound and a red light when there's something wrong. So the clinician or the nurse knows to shut the device down or do anything else relevant. And then the last resort, so to speak, is information for safety. So you put that information into an instructions for use as contraindications, for example, and then you need to rely that the people read this IFU. And if you are not sure that they will read them, it might be necessary to provide them any training on your device. That will also fall in the category C of information for safety, to make sure that they use the device according to your specifications and intended purpose. And again, a lot to do with your business. If they are not capable of using your product correctly, it is your business that is on the line. Then following on this path, you once you have controlled, let me go back. Once you have controlled these risks in one way or the other, you need to verify your controls. So do the necessary testing and or any validation activities on the clinical side or usability, for example. Then you need to estimate the residual risk. Were you able to bring the risks down? And this is very meaningful, especially if your initial risk was on the unacceptable level. So then it matters a lot whether you were able to bring that down. And then in the end, you take the clinical evaluation and you take the risk management considerations and you figure out each row separately regarding the benefits and benefit risk ratio, and then the overall benefit risk ratio of your entire product. Then you need to figure out any new risks that might arise from those controls that you put in place. And actually, overall residual risk comes after you've done all of your work here. So let me go into this flow diagram, and in a sense, this describes the same steps. You start from the hazards, end up figuring out what are the harms, and evaluating the risks, applying controls. And I'm showing you this just to give you a glimpse that this is something you need to acquire. You need to study this. You might want to come to the next training on risk management principles. And now I think it's good to give you an example to run through the entire concept. So you have this one risk. Again, we have the example of the one-channel ECG, and we have a hazard. It might be that the patch has a poor adhesive. The glue is not so good quality, or your moist skin affects the adhesive so that the patch peels off. What happens from that is that you have lack of diagnostic data. That might be how you define the hazardous situation. That's how the patient is exposed to the hazard. You don't have the patch on your skin anymore, so you don't have data. And the harm is then actually that you are not able to make any kind of diagnosis. How severe is that? Well, depends on the intended purpose of the product. If it's just to give some information and it's on your skin for days and days, it might be that one electrode peeling off might not be that relevant. But if that happens quite often, that might be another case. What is the probability of that harm occurring? According to our experience for now, with the little mock-ups that we've made, it might be that it's in the range of 3 from 1 to 5. So it's still in a green range, but we might want to do something for it. And the MDR actually tells us to mitigate every risk that we identify. So one way to go around this might be to have an inherent design, and we could use a better glue, stronger adhesive. On top of that, we might not any, it was the part A. And for B, we might not need any. And in the information for safety and warnings, we could state that it might be still better that you use it only for dry skin. And we cannot prevent sweating in that case. You do some additional testing on how the electrode sticks on the skin, and you verify that this has been implemented. You refer to a test report that you have made, and you do the estimation on the residual risk. So cannot come any lower from 1. The probability of the harm might come down a little. We came up with a new number, and in this table it might look like this. So we're talking about the minor risk, but it might be very relevant from the business perspective. And then you might need to do some benefit risk analysis on this particular line of thoughts on your controls. You might come up with an answer that is somehow positive. I just put a plus there. And but then you also needed to consider if any new risk arise from those controls, or are any existing risks affected. You might have a table where you have 10 or 50 or 100 lines of risks, and you need to consider if one of them relates to the new risk that you identified. So we might understand that we are using a stronger adhesive. This might have some concerns regarding skin reactions. So it might be that you will need to have a new line on your risk management table, and risk skin reaction to me sounds like that is the actual harm. So I will type it down here, and there might be several different routes to get to that. The strong adhesive and the materials that you have in it might be one. And you need to understand also that when you take your post-it notes at the very beginning and start to write down risks in general, you are actually talking about hazards, or you are talking about those situations, or you talk about the actual harms that happen. At first, you don't need to pay too much attention on which one it was, and you wouldn't want to debate on that too much to start off with. But in the end, you will need to think of different types of routes of the harm actually taking place, the sequence of events. So it might explode your or expand your table into quite a heavy table of information where you would need to track different sequences, and the table format is not the optimal thing for that. So that's where the electronic system might help you a little bit and do better job than an Excel file. But I need to say that no one has invented the best, let's say, the very efficient way of running risk management than an Excel table. Let me see the Q&A. Yeah, that was a good question. What does the software class mean in the risk management model spreadsheet? I will come back to that when I talk about the software standard in just a bit. But this is the moment in time where you need to consider the software risk class from the 62304 standard. So let me come back to that in just a moment. But now, since we're in the principles, I won't expand this even any further, but just to let you understand that it is also a balance of populating such a table. You must be aware of not overpopulating it and only putting the meaningful risks in it. And you will, especially if it's, for example, an electromedical device, only from the 60601 standard series, you might have hundreds of, or tens at least, or hundreds of lines of risks to consider. So that is quite a load of information to put in a table. So try to be as pragmatic as possible and quit debating on whether this was a harm or a hazard situation, but consider the product and the intended purpose and what kind of effect that then brings on the product. So it doesn't really matter that much if you did a perfect job in defining the sequence of events, but it is very crucial to understand what are the essential risks, and especially unacceptable ones, and that you do something for them to mitigate and control them. So many times it might be that you debate on the, let's say, the bolts and nuts, where you should pay attention to the intended purpose and your market when you do risk management. And then this is just one model. The FMEA model is the, let's say, the most used model, but to collect those hazards and harms, it might be that that you utilize a fault tree diagram, for example, to collect those most meaningful bits of information. So this might be what your first post-it note looks like. So use different techniques. Don't tie yourself into one and think that this is the only way to do it. Some major changes between the older version and the 2019 version. I'm not sure if this is very relevant, but just to give you some highlights, you'd want to stick to the new version. Benefit risk analysis is brought more on the table here. Some definitions like benefit, reasonably foreseeable misuse, and state-of-the-art have been introduced in the standard as well, like they exist in the regulation. More on benefits, voluntary use of data and system security risks. I'm not sure what that relates to, so let's not go into too much details. Overall residual risk is also highlighted here. Let's stick to the very basics. Post-production activities have been clarified, what you can do on your risk management after your product is on the market. And notice that many of the annexes that were very useful in the 2007 version are now moved outside from this new version. There are still annexes that many of them are now in place in the ISO technical report, which is a guidance document 24971. So it might be a smart move to buy this as well. It might even be the more important part to understand what risk management is about than the actual standard. That was the core, the 14971. Then what else relates to risk management? We will run through a few concepts and standards like usability, and this would be the IEC 62366 standard. Part 1, application of usability engineering to medical devices. It aligns to ISO 14971. It is intended to identify and minimize any use errors, so it has to do with human factors engineering. It has to do with the user experience, UX, and but it's called usability in the medical device standard vocabulary. It breaks into parts like normal use and abnormal use, and further on to correct use and use error, and resonates quite well with value proposition thinking. If you come from a different sector and you work with more, let's say, I can find the English word, but this is anyway very much to do with the UX and your value that you provide to the patient. And it is the tendency of the regulators to look more into detail of the usability nowadays, and I hope it will grow more in a meaning to provide sufficiently safe and efficient products. With many devices, the usability is not on a very good level. So let me just quickly again give you a glimpse from what you will need to purchase. This is the usability standard, and this is the cycle of events that you need to take into account and directly relates to your risk management. So it depends on the perception first of the user, how you visualize things on your device or software. What is the cognition of that person? Another error-prone place. Then the action, based on how they understand what they are supposed to do with the device. The action might go wrong and create a hazardous situation, or the action might be feeding an input into the system, for example, software. So the input, when it is processed in the medical device, the device does it just as it is told to, but the output might be something that was not the intention of your device or the user, and there's a hazard situation from that perspective. So when you do that fault tree diagram, or you start populating your first post-it notes, this might be a very good starting point to look at. This table in the 62366 standard. Then let's talk about that software. The software lifecycle standard, IEC 62304, contains all processes within the lifecycle: development, changes, and maintenance. It leaves room for agile methods, and you can, by all means, have your development sprints, but you need to apply the relevant reviews and approvals. And this again aligns with the ISO 14971 and talks a lot about risks. And now we get to the point where we had that software risk class in the table as well. The standard defines that you must develop your processes within your quality management system to develop and maintain the software depending on the level of severity it provides for the user. And here, just like in the risk classification of devices, it divides into three. Class A would be the least severe, then the class B, and then the class C. So you could think of this being the new class 2A, this being the new class 2B, and the class C would be your class 3 device. Of course, this is a different type of classification, but the IMDRF categorization, I will just give you a quick glimpse into the table. This is in the MDCG document. This might help you out also with categorizing this from the software standard perspective, the significance of information, and what is the state of healthcare situation or the patient condition. But don't be fooled with it to being the same thing. This is to set up the meaningful processes item by item in your software or for the entire software that you're building. And when you need to consider this is at that stage where you didn't apply any controls on your risks yet. You've done the first round up till here, the sequence of events you have estimated, evaluated, and now you didn't apply any controls yet, not the A, not the B, not the C, but you need to consider the worst case scenario before controls and apply the risk class and use this decision tree at that stage. Can a hazardous situation arise from a failure? If not, it's class A. What would be the effectiveness of risk control measures external to the software? So nothing. Mainly, you can figure out what kind of information you can provide at this stage, but nothing more. You didn't build any inherent safety precautions in your product. And then, if there remains an unacceptable risk, what severity of injury is it possible of doing? Death or something less serious? So it looks like a lot similar to class 2A, 2B, and class 3. And then what this does to your product development, what is the effect? Here in the table in the standard, it tells you that for class 2A devices, you don't need to take into account all the clauses of the standard. Then class B and class C are almost identical in what you need to take into account. But then also, I would want to highlight that even though today you would consider your device being a class A, you would want to check into your regulatory strategy and your plans for the future into whether you'd want to bring in new intended purposes, for example. And the requirements might not be that harsh that you just want to pass them. But this is also about building the capability within your organization to later on build certain types of medical devices. And very noteworthy is that for a class 1 device, not even the software architecture is needed to be drawn. And I think that is just basic good business practice to draw the architecture of the software. So don't look blindly into what these tell you, but do meaningful things for your business again. Even do it the hardest way and with the most reviews needed in your software development if you are certain that there will be use for your knowledge and your platform of software. And then here is the same thing, same chapters in a flow of development. There is a similar flow described also for maintenance. And here is the relation between the activities that you do in system development and the software risk management. So also the table gives you the idea that it has everything to do with risk management. And this is the flow of events to get the software developed. There was a question, would a leak or private health data, a leak of private health data be a hazardous situation? Cybersecurity is a thing that needs to be taken into account. That's also stated in the MDR nowadays. And privacy comes from the GDPR. It's a fine line on what would be considered medical device risk that you need to and you have to consider in your risk management table. But I would be smarter than that and consider any types of risks in a similar format and keep them in one place. Maybe highlight the ones that are not related to medical device regulations, but rather to GDPR, for example. But you can nonetheless utilize the same methods, and there are probably some requirements that are relevant also from the MDR perspective in this sense. So I hope that opens up the philosophy here. Then let's talk about electrical safety. This would be this massive 60601 standard series. And this standard talks about general requirements for basic safety and essential performance of the medical device. And essential performance is a very important term and has a lot to do with risks. It's defined as the performance necessary to achieve freedom from unacceptable risks. So, for example, in an ECG monitor, a patient monitor beside the bed, it might be that it shows faulty diagrams on the screen. That would be essential performance of that device. It shouldn't do that. So how do you tackle that? You need to consider it through your risk management as well. And it's specific for your type of a device. Then you need to understand that the 601 standard contains various collateral standards and also particular standards. Collaterals would be on the horizontal level, and like the EMC, that needs to be taken into account for all types of medical devices and usability as well, alarms. And if it's a home healthcare environment, that would be also a collateral standard for any devices that are brought home. And then there are the vertical standards, which are the particulars, and they dive into specific technology, for example, the ECG, EEG, X-rays, MR, and such. And these, again, would be a very valuable source of various risks and in design inputs into your product development and should be collected at day one. There may be some, you might learn of some that might look like showstoppers for you to enter the market, but at least you will be aware before you move ahead and collect all your funding and such to know where you are headed. And the compliance according to 60601, it's inspected many times. I believe there are some 150 requirements related to risk management only in the 60601 basic standard. And the IECEE, electromedical certification body, they provide a scheme of CB test labs that you might want to utilize. They would be the accredited test labs that provide you the one stop shop type of a solution and single certification that proves your way also, for example, in the US for occupational safety. So you don't need to cover the requirements several times or do not need to mark your product several times, but get that one testing done from a body, from a test lab that gives you, for example, the ETL or the UL label on the device, and you will be a lot easier off in the international market. Then a few words about biological safety. These are all topics actually that we talk more in detail in separate sessions. So we take, for example, the biological and electromedical safety issues in one session, because they both relate to hardware devices. Software is another session completely. And again, the part 1, the main standard in the series, talks about testing within risk management process. Part 2 relates to animal welfare. It basically says that whenever possible, don't bother the animals. It's not ethical, only in absolutely necessary cases. And I have highlighted in green a few essential concepts that you need to take into account with every type of medical device. Cytotoxicity relates to products that might cause cancer, and irritation, skin sensitization are more understandable concepts for anyone. And then there are loads of others, like considerations regarding implantations and such, but this would be the minimum setting that you need to consider for any type of a product. And I will give you, again, a visual from the standard. So this table A in the 2018 version of the standard defines the endpoints to be addressed in your biological risk assessment. So here you have such topics as nature of body contact, whether it's a surface device or communicating somehow, or if it's an implant, and then the contact, whether it's an intact skin, whether it's your mouth, for example, or other breached, compromised surfaces. What is the contact duration? And taking all of these into account, the least risky product would come on your intact skin and remain there for very short time period. And for such a product, and for any type of product, you need to do the chemical characterization, and then on top consider those 3 elements: cytotoxicity, sensitization, and irritation. And as you can see, if you go any further from that and to any more serious things, the different parts of the standard series provides you more things to consider. And when you go ahead, move into implants, there's a lot of things to take into account. And the very important part here is the chemical characterization of materials. So this is, again, something that we would advise you to take into account at very early stages, because it's another standard series that provides you with a lot of design inputs and risks at day 1. It covers the patient's body, but you might be wiser to take into account the user as well. So this standard does not consider anything else than the or actually, if intended for protection, like masks, then the user's body as well. The old standard didn't consider the user at all. This applies to devices that come into direct or indirect contact with the patient, and indirect might mean that it's a flow of fluids, for example, that goes through a tubing, and the tube then needs to be considered an indirect contact with the patient. And it's not a rigid set of test methods, like you should approach any standard in the same way, that this is not everything you need to do, but you need to use your own head as well to add on anything important that is missing, or interpret the requirements from your device's perspective. And just like clinical evaluation, this one is also intended for use by professionals. So you should have a toxicologist or someone to sign out your biological safety report, and hopefully to plan it as well. And many larger companies go wrong in this area as well. And there is a lot of variance in the quality of these reports in the past, and it is beginning to align when the new, this is a very good standard, again, a good new version of the standard. And it does not require that you do all the retesting for any historical products, but you can provide justification instead. And a very problematic thing to gain the needed information from the material providers and your vendors. Let's talk about this in a separate session in more detail. And then when you reach the end of your risk considerations, it's the benefit risk analysis for your entire product as the final outcome. So you do this for all individual lines of risks in your table, and then for the risks overall. And it would be wise, it would be wise to start early in your product development phases to begin considering these. And even go as far as to make your first risk-benefit considerations at the very early stage. And then in the end, you check to the mother of all the requirements, that would be the Annex 1 and your table describing the general safety and performance requirements. So all of your evidence would then support what you planned ahead to tackle these requirements with. And this is also probably an evolution during your product development, starting off from the feasibility, slowly adding on information and new evidence. And remember, risk management is something where you'd be better off to utilize all your technical and clinical expertise in-house and hired. So that would be the end of introductions into clinical evaluation and risk management. And next, in session 4 on Friday, we will talk about the design control and the regulatory environment, so you will have a better understanding on the world where you're living in. We will talk about notified bodies, test labs, and authorities, and some considerations on the changing global regulations.